what that was. It was interesting. And I think that to have these conversations is extremely important because it brings to light some things that you may be confused about or that others may have been purporting as clear untruths. That's the art of conversation. That's why we have them. It's necessary for us to do so. We're getting to our final conversation for the week and the last Friday of the month. Our conversation this hour might be another firecracker one. When it comes to what we're discussing this morning, two guests are in the hot seat of the Situation Room this morning. We're looking at the crisis economy. Who benefits when Kenya essentially is facing disaster? Mm-hmm. Who benefits when Kenya is underfoot? Okay. Dustin Barter is a development and humanitarian researcher, joins us in the hot seat of the Situation Room this morning. Dustin, good morning.
Morning. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. Timothy Kiprono is a public finance, governance and climate finance expert, joins us also in the Situation Room this morning. Good morning.
Great. Good morning to you.
Karibu sana.
Asante.
I can already tell you that there might be some interesting opinions coming out of this conversation this morning because who benefits? We may know them, but we may not call them out. Today, we'll call them out in terms of who benefits, but also finding solutions as to these disasters and what can actually be done. As you know, or you may not know, we go around the African continent every week. We come back from a particular country with its proverbs. This week, we've been in Guinea. In Francophone Africa, Francophone West Africa specifically. And our proverb, we'd love to get your interpretation of it. Your beauty will take you there, but your character will bring you back. Your beauty will take you there, but your character will bring you back. Start with you, Dustin. What do you think about that? How would you interpret that?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent proverb, and I love how it's, okay, maybe beauty is getting you into opening certain doors in certain scenarios, and then it's about where do you come back to in terms of your character and accountability and commitment to ideas beyond the superficial nature of your beauty, is my interpretation.
Okay. Mm-hmm. What do you think?
Yeah, it's very interesting analogy of I would think about, for example, relate to systems. We have very beautiful systems in Kenya. For example, we have laws and frameworks for just relating to this particular subject. But when it comes to applying them, you realize it's not beautiful, and not as strong as they are. But they could be strong. But if you don't take care of your beauty, it just shows eventually who you are. You do nice makeup, and when you take off the makeup, for example, then or you don't take care of it, then it kind of exposes you. So I think it's our systems as well. Yeah,
indeed. Okay, so there are many things that countries go through that would be deemed as disaster. We hear about them and we think floods, we think about famine, and we think about drought and all of that. But there are other things that can be happening. Economic disaster, very possible that, improper use of resources around the country can also be deemed as disaster. There are things that keep us down. Off the top of it, Timothy, we start with you. Are there things or are there folks who are benefiting when a country like Kenya is not doing so well in particular areas?
Of course.
Okay.
Well, okay, so crisis economy. So maybe just let me start there and say that yes, we have, or well, rather, we don't just have crisis economy. We also have another one, which is redistributional economy. What happens when disaster happens is that resources move quickly, and these resources moves in billions. And it kind of like creates a justification to move resources from development, for example, to response. And in that kind of situation, there are people, of course, who benefit. Political and budget actors, find justification to move resources from things that were planned for before to something else. And this something else, of course, in the sense that of crisis, is that I'll call it a black box for citizens because they don't know how that money is used. and they're not involved in the movement of that money. And then eventually, of course, participation is also very limited in that sense. So the political actors, the budget actors also benefit from that. The second kind of actors are also, market, movers. When emergency happens, procurement systems are changed from open procurement in development. For if you move money from development, it would have gone through open procurement systems. But now, because it's emergency, you put, you hold on to. You hold your open procurement to kind of apply what is called direct procurement, for example. Then prices also go up, and the suppliers benefit from that. And so there are probably people who would like that crisis to continue, so that then the business opportunities also happen. And then the last kind of actors, of course, external actors. So in the case of county governments, for example, national government come in to support, but also humanitarian actors. So we're talking about NGOs and other people who bring money to the economy. And part of the reason that happens is that because our systems break down, and of course there are other reasons why humanitarian actors also come into play and benefit from that.
Wow. Dustin, humanitarian aid, relief aid, emergency response is all meant to be a good thing, because it is meant to come in and create an intervention or you have a disaster, mitigate against loss of life, mostly, and also maybe move people to where life can be more sustainable. So when resources are rapidly moved, it is a good thing, because it means we can have action in time, and we can have minimal losses, if at all. But that seems not to be the case, because we have a long history, especially in our country, Kenya, or in Africa, large, and also in other like Middle East countries, where you have long-going humanitarian aid provision. But we don't see the impact of that aid. It is short-lived. Of course, the impact is seen from the beneficiaries or the benefactors, but the people who are supposed to receive this aid or intervention or support, rarely do we see actual sustainable impact. How would you, in your own assessment, rate that impact analysis?
That's an excellent question, and this is a lot of what we cover in our report, Governing Inequality, Kenya's State, Aid Politics and Perpetual Humanitarian Crisis. And there is this kind of tension between this need and urgent, pressing need to save lives, which is invaluable, and that is critical. But again, this kind of focus on the short-term dynamics without addressing what are the underlying causes and drivers of people to be vulnerable in the first place. So if we look at Kenya as the focus of our study, but this happens in many other countries, in Kenya you have 200 to 400 million US dollars coming in every year to kind of alleviate this human suffering, save lives. But there's no real effort to kind of address why are people vulnerable in the first place. And across the arid and semi-arid lands, which make up, a huge part of Kenya, a lot of those populations living in those areas suffer from lack of investment, lack of infrastructure, access to water, access to jobs, access to social services. And so when a crisis strikes, whether it's drought, whether it's flood, and this happens all the time in Kenya, then they are kind of hit and extremely vulnerable, and then the international system steps in, and it's kind of this rinse and repeat every single year without going, okay, how do we actually invest in these communities to make sure they are resilient in the first place? And this has been going on for years and years, and there are a lot of vested interests in the way this aid economy has been established. So we need to kind of go beyond the short-term thinking, which is really more around looking at structural inequalities and also like governance issues in Kenya and elsewhere.
Okay. So is the aid industry helping to perpetuate historical and geographical inequalities in Kenya? And is it posing a barrier to state-led crisis response? Is it?
I think absolutely. I think there are so many vested interests within the aid system from many donors. If we look at a lot of the US actions, particularly of late, so the US is really weaponizing and politicizing aid in Kenya, across the world. There's also not just the crisis response, but the US funding around health systems in Kenya, and then the kind of extraction of data that was proposed with that, extremely controversial. But then within, if you look at all the aid actors in Kenya, you have nearly all the funding, over 90%, flows to international actors, UN agencies, and international non-government organizations. And so all these actors control 90% plus of the funding coming in. They all have vested interest to expand their programs and kind of keep the aid industry going on. And if you start to genuinely address the structural inequalities and the governance issues in Kenya, then you don't really need the aid system to do nearly all that it's doing. So it's about trying to break out of that and get past these perpetual structural inequalities.
Okay.
Wow. It's interesting because keep
Yes.
on, right. The aid industry comes to start and step in to do what the government ought to be doing, what our public finance systems ought to be doing. Because our constitution provides for everything that a Kenyan need. In times there's a disaster, there's a disaster fund.
Yes.
You know, in times of any crisis, the constitutions provide. But then now the aid industry comes in, as Noe is asking, it comes to sort of interfere and sustain another culture where there is aid dependency. Does that, in your opinion, take away our structural strength? Because our institutions are not as strong as they ought to be. If we did not have the aid industry, maybe we would have revised to see our systems strong enough, resilient enough to withstand whatever shockers will come our way. It could be agricultural crisis, medical crisis, a natural calamity. How would you rate our institutional strength vis-a-vis the aid industry and now the violation of our public finance?
Absolutely. And that's a very interesting question in the sense that we start looking at, what kind of systems do we have in place and do they function, as it were. So you're very right that our legal framework provides for safeguards for, how we deal with this kind of crisis. The Constitution, first of all, when it kind of devolved system, kind of divided functions between national and county governments, gave counties mandate to deal with disasters as a primary actor.
Right.
And then allowed national government to come in to support counties in dealing with that, partially because counties are closer to people, so they are in a better place to respond.
Correct.
And so if you look at PFM, for example, Act, Section 110, it mandates all counties to establish an emergency fund. And this emergency fund is supposed to be a fund. You take money out of your regular budget and put it aside. So that money is supposed to be, the reason why it sits aside outside the regular system is because it's for rapid response. Rapid response means if it floods now, we don't need to go looking for money in the budget because you cannot plan for an emergency as a regular, the way you plan for your salaries and other things. And so every county in Kenya have an emergency fund, or at least it's expected to have an emergency fund. And then we have several other instruments. Of course, Section 116 of the PFM Act allows counties to set up other instruments. At national level, we have the National Drought Emergency Fund, which is supposed then to also deal with, you can see by the name, it's the drought, and so forth. Now,
I thought the name was supposed to, but it's okay.
Yeah. So you can see already we have instruments in place. So at the county level, you have emergency fund, you have disaster risk management fund, and then you have something else called county climate change fund, which is supported by, if you've heard of something called FLOCA, supported by World Bank. Now, these instruments are supposed to do three things. One is rapid response, which is the emergency fund. The disaster risk management fund is supposed to be an active instrument, looking back and looking forward to say, if we responded, what did we respond to and what caused that response? And then use that information to inform the investment for the future. How do we build resilience? Now, the aid either strengthens the system or weakens the system. Now,
in our case?
Yes. In our case, it actually weakens in a lot of ways because we've seen in counties the emergency fund is not even visible. The communities don't have an idea about it exists. We went to Garissa, Marsabit and Tana River and asked citizens whether they know the emergency fund, and most of them are like, no, we even don't know. Now, if they don't know the primary instrument that is supposed to respond to the disasters and the challenges they face every day, then what is the purpose of that fund? What they know is the humanitarian aid. They know that, World Vision comes with money, for example. And then they also know that, the people who respond to disasters are NGOs. Then what it means is that our systems are not doing what it's supposed to do. And the challenge here is that when humanitarian actors come and run parallel systems to the systems that exist, then they're not serving the purpose that they should serve, which is come and support systems that are
already functioning.
Yes.
Yeah.
So work with it, develop it, so that even if they're not there, then the systems can continue function. Take, for example, what happened to USAID. USAID, when they exited, what happened to healthcare?
Crisis.
We almost collapsed. Now imagine a situation where humanitarian actors also exit the space, while our systems have been weakened because governors know, NGOs will come and respond, right? And so they don't strengthen the emergency fund, for example. So it becomes a problem.
When you hear this, Dustin, and also we can borrow examples from across the globe, actually. Aid industry thrives in corrupt systems. Aid industry has been here with us for decades. How do you justify the refinancing of interventions that clearly you can see they're not strengthening the local systems and the impact to the people, to the populace, because there has to be accountability, there has to be sustainability, is not at par? How do you justify the continuous thriving of the aid industry, especially now in countries where these systems are weak and corrupt?
Another excellent question. I think there's a few dynamics going on from this point Timothy was making, which is really excellent. Like a lot of countries I've worked in, you go to different communities and you ask, okay, if you had a problem or if you ran out of money or food, who would you go to? And often the answer is, this NGO or this UN agency. And that is kind of reflective of a lot of the dynamics we are talking about. But in terms of the corruption, I think there's really this nuance, which is kind of a difficult balance to kind of go along. That, okay, yes, corruption and illicit financial flows are a big issue in many countries, but the idea of just suddenly cutting off aid and doing essentially shock therapy is extremely dangerous, because you have this whole system that just collapses, as we saw to some degree last year, and may actually escalate even further this year in Kenya, Somalia, across the world. And that means a lot of people dying and potential famine in many locations. So this sudden shock therapy is not the way to do it. It's how do you go through a staged process of handing over, and also looking towards those long-term solutions, but also focusing on aspects like civic space, civil society activity to hold authorities accountable, rather than just going, okay, we're going to cut off aid that can be extremely disruptive. So some of our research also looks at, in parallel to the aid system, you actually have illicit financial flows in Kenya that are about 1.5 billion annually, and this is reported by multiple different sources. And so if you start to tackle that, the aid money becomes less relevant. But if you don't tackle the illicit financial flows first, cutting off aid is deeply irresponsible. And there is also this one element as well of a lot of aid props up negative things, but then there are aspects. There is a lot of accountability systems within a lot of aid. So a lot of donors impose very strict conditionalities, and so not the entire system is corrupt per se, but it kind of feeds into a lot of problematic governance dynamics in many countries.
And you see those governance dynamics somehow. They allow or create room for infiltration now of culture, because there's also the social impact, the social aspect of it. When parallel programs are being run by the government and the aid community, we've seen cases in various countries whereby there's a bit of a clash between culture, because this will come with an organized agenda. This is what they are offering as aid, as an intervention. However, they would want this community to respond in this particular manner. So how do we find the safety nets, or the safeguards for the communities that are vulnerable at the time? Because everybody who is seeking aid at the time, they are vulnerable, be they an individual, a community, or a government. How do we say? Do we have safeguards from exploitation? Is there a monitoring scheme where you'd be able to say, okay, this aid comes in this form and manner, this is the expected impact, however, we need to be cautious of these ramifications. What are the safeguards we have, and how is that looking like from the report? What points of exploitation did you discover from the aid community that now the local administration needs to be very, on the outlook?
I can list off some very bad examples. Previously working in Bangladesh, in Cox's Bazar, at the Rohingya genocide. And I arrived, went round, and there are accountability boxes where people could put in a note saying, oh, they have an issue or concern about something.
Yeah.
This is for a population that basically was not particularly literate. All the signs were in a language they didn't understand. And unsurprisingly, all the boxes were empty. So it's like there was an accountability system in theory, but not actually used. Then you have other dynamics, like going back to, I was in Kenya in 2012, up in Kakuma and Turkana, and you had excellent, like Canary, the Kakuma News Reflector, like a locally led, refugee-run outlet for holding the aid system to account. And then it reported on different issues, but it really faced so much pressure from UN agencies and from others to not report on aid problems, aid misuse. And so you have these kind of like excellent, very effective like refugee-run systems such as Canary, but then they face these immense pressures because there is a lot of pushback from different aid actors to avoid accountability. But at the same time, there are more boring processes such as procurement of getting, various quotes and other aspects that there is degrees of accountability, and it's certainly improved. I think there's been some innovations in certain countries around using mobile phone-based or text-based text messages to improve accountability. So it does exist. It has improved in many ways, but the other examples in Bangladesh and Kakuma and Turkana are examples of like things that still have a long way to go.
Whether somebody actually benefits when Kenya or any other country in the developing world is facing these disasters that we talk about. And normally we think, okay, so there's flooding, there's a disaster, there's drought, so there's a disaster. Well, there's also corruption. That's a disaster of epic proportions. And that are actually taking the resources away from these systems and processes then that invite industry aid. I'm going to say that again. Corruption takes away the resources from these systems that essentially then invite industry aid. That if we didn't have the loss of these resources, guess what? We wouldn't need this aid that comes from whomever it comes from. So, I am the Lord over the one who begs from me. It doesn't matter how thin you slice it. The person who you are giving aid to is your subject. You will do what they say, and there is an element of control that you wield over them. Is that not by design? That you keep people in a state of needing you so that you can control them? That's how I see it. Or is it different from that?
Nope. You're right.
Yeah.
Absolutely right. And it's a chain.
Yeah.
So let's look at it as a 3-step, for example, just to simplify. So the aid actors are here, and then you have a government sitting here, and then you have the people sitting down below here. So the aid actors who don't want to strengthen the systems, so that they want the governments to continue coming back to them, what you call begging them. And then the government, for political reasons and, working together with the aid, want to keep the citizens poor. So that then they continue coming. For political reasons, including elections, when people are poor, it's easy to manipulate them. Now, so, and this happens in a system where you have systems that are supposed to be building. And that's what Dustin talked about. Like, why are we not addressing the root causes? It's not that we don't know. And so that brings us to the point of, why are disasters recurring in Kenya? It's not like we don't know. We knew it was going to rain. And we know we're going to have a drought in just a few months. But why is that recurring? So it's for the very reason that we want to keep people at the same state continuously so we can control them. And so we cannot build resilience. If it's drought, for example, why not build irrigation systems? If there's flooding, for example, why not abstract that water and use when drought comes, right? And it's not like we don't know these things, we know them. So the very reason for that is so that we keep the status quo.
So if the mother and the father and the nurturer of the aid community is our public finance systems,
yes,
would it be prudent, for any government that seeks to serve its people well, to fix that root cause? So that, because, and it's funny to hear this, that even in our budget making process, there is room for aid. They say we anticipate there'll be this aid coming. So already that door is open for manipulation, because even the funds that are set aside for crisis and intervention, they are not accounted for. The efficiency is highly questionable. So would it be fair to expect that a good government will first streamline its financial mechanism measures. It's policy, public policy, because we know, like, if you are to stick to our country, we know the layout of our country. This area is semi-arid, the Asal region.
Yeah.
These are highlands, this is the coastal line, the lake basin, we know. So we know what challenges to expect from those areas. Could be in form of disease, in form of food shortage, in form of just, the landslides and all that.
Yeah.
So we do know. So is it the failure of the government in coordination with now the corrupt system they are in that keeps the aid community in business? Because one would ask, why keep giving money where a certain a good percentage of it is going to be pilfered? You will come back and report there was no efficiency because of a corrupt system. But you continue doing this year on, year in for decades. So wouldn't a good government first, if they really want to help the people, and I'm just trying to hammer in the point where you say they keep you poor so they can control you. And I hope you can hear, they keep you poor, not by mistake, so they can control you. Yes. And now when you're too hungry, you're almost dying, they come and give you relief food to keep you alive long enough until the next aid budget comes into play.
And even worse, should you stand up to it and say, actually, we don't need you, then they sanction you to make it seem as though you are anti-development. Do we see here? It's an intricate web of deliberate control. Sounds like the mafia to me. And the last time I checked, they operate illegally. The mafia.
I don't know about the mafia.
I think what you're talking about is really kind of these global dynamics. I think the US is maybe the biggest microcosm or macrocosm of this, of extreme inequality and concentrations of wealth. So for decades, a lot of Western countries, the so-called global north, have pushed this kind of deregulation, extreme inequality to be pushed onto Kenya and many other countries, pushing down trade barriers, having uneven trade practices. And therefore, it's like, okay, we'll give you the scraps from the table, which is a little bit of aid, whether that's humanitarian development or otherwise. But we're going to maintain these deep structural inequalities between so-called global north and so-called global south. And so how does this kind of feed into those systems, and how do you address those deeper structures? When we know a lot of countries, particularly, if we look at South Korea, Japan, they rapidly developed and industrialized through being able to have a strong state that focused on industrialization and development. But that's kind of been kicked away by a lot of global north actors for Kenya and elsewhere. So even things like the ability to tax exports of flowers in Kenya and other industries, that's not effectively taxed. So instead you push all the burden onto the public in terms of income tax, but without addressing the kind of multinational taxes. And this is really kind of critical, yet not really addressed. And how does aid, I think what you're kind of alluding to, and I think is very clear, aid kind of forms part of this political economy that really favours this global north and disempowers the global south in a lot of instances.
Timothy, I don't want to berate or belittle the assistance and what it has done in certain sectors.
Absolutely.
Because we have children, babies, whose lives were saved because aid money came in. We have women who, for maternal things like maternal death, numbers were greatly reduced. We have seed, like the actual seeds that you put in the ground that were preserved as a result of money that came in. My issue is that if the systems that nations have, however you've set them up, were functioning the way that they are supposed to, we wouldn't need it. So we could actually stand up and say, thank you. How about we collaborate on other issues, such as making sure that global taxation was balanced? Then, we can have that conversation. Because I'm not sitting here wondering about whether my nation's babies are dying. I'm not sitting wondering whether people in Makweni will have mature seed to put in the ground in the next rainy season. But so now, you people are going to keep me here dealing with those issues, while on the global scale, you're discussing how you're going to come and tax me in the future. I'm saying that if we fix our systems, we can then concentrate on the things that we call unfair in a global space, so that when we're talking about the permanent representative of the United Nations, that we can be having that conversation, because nobody will look at me and say, excuse me, your babies are dying, you can't figure out your health system, you can't figure out how you're going to get medication for those who are living with HIV. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yep.
That we've split it so much that how about we have you trying to figure out these survival things, right, while we discuss how we're going to have a global mechanism for how the value of tea, which you give us, is going to be determined. How the diamonds from Botswana will be dealt on a global scale. How the gold coming out of Ghana or Kenya is going to be dealt. How the cocoa that comes out of Ghana will be sold in Switzerland, who does not own one cocoa bush. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yep.
That we are kept dealing with these things that are matters of life, death, bread and butter, so that they can have a conversation over here. But if we were allowed and also then insisted on fixing these systems, we could be in those conversations.
Absolutely. I actually wouldn't say we are allowed. Let me just picking from what you say. Because, I mean, we don't need permission, really, to fix our systems.
Exactly.
We have our constitution, we have the legal frameworks, we have everything else. And at the beginning, I mentioned, how the humanitarian, like how our legal frameworks anticipated that we will have humanitarian systems or crises or emergencies, and how do we deal with it? Now, we have systems, and just tying that with a question, we have systems, but I think we are kept busy, dealing with problems, then we don't have time to deal with these bigger global problems. Now let's look at just translate that into some form of, or explain how the systems exist. Now in Kenya we don't lack legal frameworks.
No.
We don't lack resources. And I can show you that in 2024 we moved 75 billion from development budget to response at the national level. This year alone, just a few months ago in January, through the first supplementary budget that went to Parliament, there is 13.5 billion that's available for disaster, and that is the special programs, State Department budget moving from 654 million to 13.5 billion just to respond to disasters. Now, here you have a government that has the resources to actually respond. Now, this is like you're moving money from a budget. Let's go back to the instruments that we set up for ourselves. So if we have a national drought, emergency fund at national level, because the fund is supposed to sit outside the budget, why not resource it when already drought is going to happen, right? So that then you don't end up in this crisis of moving money and going to donors and asking them to give you money, because you have instruments. At the county level, you have an emergency fund. This emergency fund should contain at least 2% of your total revenue every year. And so it's supposed to accumulate. Now, why not resource that and make it available? When disaster doesn't happen, let it accumulate. So that then when you need it, then you can go to your instruments. So instead, it is by design that we don't operationalize our systems. The legal frameworks, which of course talks about accountability, how do we account for it, how do we manage it, and so forth, and then how do we respond to disasters and how do we finance it. So that then when disaster happens, then we run around, looking for money from donors and from our budget, which means sacrificing something else in our budget to respond to disasters. And coming back to status quo, is that it's very interesting for political class and humanitarian actors and the budget actors that this crisis remains, so that then the money that we move from development to crisis is very invisible. Like that black box. I mean, it's very difficult for anyone to see. We haven't seen any. In the counties that I've been, I haven't seen a list of beneficiaries. I haven't seen how the emergency fund was spent. So that means when money goes there, no one knows how it was
spent.
Yeah.
Now, Dustin, we are going into the last quarter of the financial year, and there'll be rapid financial movement because people need to exhaust the coffers and then raise budgets for the next cycle. Do we continue to expect the same old same? Because we seem to be clear on what the problem is. We understand the aid industry is an industry that wants to the status quo to remain so they can remain in business, because there is where they source the funds from. And if you dig backwards, you realize some of them are trying to have tax exemption from their mother countries. Others are trying to diverse resources. Others is illicit financial movement. A lot of things play in the back room before you are presented with a check of an aid. Then when it is received here, our public financial management system also are not prudent. Okay, we have enough laws, I do agree, but we are not prudent enough in matters of practice. So the problem is clear. And unfortunately, we use humans to sustain this trade. We use humans who should be the benefactors, the beneficiaries, to pilferage money. And now you have the backhand of the beneficiaries, at the mega level is a whole different conversation. You realize $1 billion USD might be raised, but only 300 million will get to the purported benefactor or beneficiary. So today we understand that problem. You generated a very solid report. Your organizations are trying to mop up information to see how do we now shape up the next best policy that will benefit people more and preferably have better utilization of resources. Is there hope for that change? Are these reports being consumed appropriately by the intended recipients? And what is the best course of action for both, maybe from the government and the aid industry?
Hopefully the reports go viral. At ODI Global, where I work, and Institute of Public Finance Kenya, we've put a lot of effort into kind of bringing these conversations together. I remember being on a podcast about 2.5 years ago, and they're like, okay, at the end of 2023, before the world went even crazier, like, what do you want to be talking about in the future? And I was like, so boring, but I want to talk about tax and bringing tax and humanitarianism together. And then 2.5 years later, we're in this room talking about these kind of critical issues. So that's exciting. I think within the humanitarian and the broader aid sector, we need to recognize it's not a homogenous beast, and there are a lot of actors. Oxfam in Oxfam Kenya is doing a lot to kind of address these governance dynamics. They've done a lot of great work on inequality. ODI Global, where I work, we're also trying to push this kind of governance lens, engaging politically within the aid sector. So we need to be responsible of not just going, okay, let's cut off all the aid and then that will be better, but how do we responsibly transition? But I think a lot of what you're talking about, there's just so many vested interests in maintaining the status quo. From the head of the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, Tom Fletcher, is pushing this very detrimental narrative around, let's make humanitarianism back to basics, let's push more food, cash, all these simple things, and disengage from these broader governance issues. And I think that is hugely detrimental to the sector writ large. And I think it's also important, there are many donors that I engage with at a lot of different levels, across Western Europe and elsewhere, and they do have a genuine interest in improving the way things work and supporting global South governments and changing the way aid operates. But there are a lot of global power structures at play, and just recognizing that the Trump administration in the US is really causing so many problems. If we look at the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was kind of one of the most extreme examples of this weaponized, politicized aid that led to a lot of Palestinians, Gazans being killed, and so you've got this kind of negative OCHA and US kind of drive in a certain direction, but then there are a lot of more principled actors going, no, we need to come together, do things with collective action, solidarity, and I think that's really important, that we don't just dismiss everything, but how do we bring different actors together in the way that we are coming together today and speaking about our reports and kind of collaborating with humanitarian focus, but also public finance and tax focus. So I think that's really important. And also with the youth, I think youth-led activism is so critical. You've seen it in Kenya and elsewhere. But how do you build alliances from, maybe urban centres where a lot of youth are concentrated and quite active, but also talking about the arid and semi-arid lands, and build this collective action to address these deep structural issues, deep structural inequalities.
Well, Kip, this is interesting. You take it as you may.
Sure.
If the body of Jesus Christ was found today, the whole Christian religion would collapse. Or if the devil got saved today, the whole faith ministry will collapse. Public finance management, if you strengthen your systems and the countries are more focused on offering a better public policy, the aid industry would collapse. You see the connection? So, what direction Kenya moving forward?
Very interesting question, and I'm happy that you asked that question because I mean that's where the solution lies.
Right.
Our PFM system is very strong. It provided the processes, it provided the systems, it recognizes disasters and emergencies. So it means we just need to operationalize it. So we need to turn the architecture of our legal framework into systems. And these systems, in my view, will do three things. Be ready to respond when disasters happen. And that is the rapid response mechanisms that we have, emergency fund, disaster risk, management funds. And then kind of learn from what we do. When we respond to disasters once, twice, there are lessons we learn. And it's and flood, for example, if you respond twice, you can already see a pattern of what is causing the flooding or drought, for example. Then use that as a lesson and think about how do we invest then in prevention. And that's where kind of like adaptation, to climate problems comes into play. And we have systems for that. The county climate change funds, for example, exist to do that, to serve that purpose, learning from how we respond, using the lessons, and think about what then systems do we need to put in place. So if you look at that ecosystem, is that we have emergency funds that sit as a insurance. I mean, the same way you have an health insurance, right? But you still go to the gym. The purpose is that you keep yourself fit. Now, but you say, well, if the gym is not helping me, then I have an insurance to fall back to. So it's the same thing. Emergency fund is more of our insurance kind of system. Climate adaptation investment is more of the practice and the getting fit and being a child or a child to the systems that we are anticipating to face. So we need to operationalize that system,
right?
And our PFM has provided the infrastructure for that, so that then we don't lack that for a start. And then our citizens, just one minute, our citizens and civil society need to step up. We have a responsibility to pay tax. We are taxpayers before we are, subject to emergencies and crises. Now we need to follow that money, and we also voters. When we elect leaders, we surrender part of the power, and then we remain with part of it. We need to exercise the part of it that we have, holding accountable Parliament, county assemblies, and the executives on how they use the taxes that we have before humanitarian aid comes.
Wow, and better yet, getting the right persons in office.
Yep.
So, Dustin, perhaps, there's always potentiation even of medication. Now, when aid comes into play, it generates other crises. I don't know whether that is noted. Because sometimes we hear they're extending humanitarian aid, which ends up being in form of guns that sustains a war. We have over 50 conflict areas now in the world. And most of those countries or those areas, they don't manufacture guns. It is aid, in quotes or not. So how do we connect the dots? That, you sustain a war, people are going to go hungry. You have seen the desertification of the Gaza Strip, So now you need to do the whole reconstruction of the housing. People need to know where to get food. So you can always see the subsequent crisis that will come from whatever it is you're trying to deal with now. But again, it depends on the interest. What we are asking earlier on, who benefits? What is the goal? I think the bigger goal of the aid or the donor supersedes the goals of the person being helped. In your report, what are the shocking, revelations you've realized of the perpetual crises that have come from the aid community, from the aid industry?
Sure, excellent question again. I think one way to visualize it is throwing a rock, and that rock is aid into a river, and the river just keeps on gushing past, and it's like, okay, the rock can only do so much. I think Sudan is a particularly illustrative example where a lot of these dynamics around the flow of weapons and geopolitical dynamics, particularly the United Arab Emirates is pouring so much money into the rapid support forces, a lot of weapons, and so that is stirring up and exacerbating extremely violent conflict across Sudan, mass displacement, huge humanitarian crisis. And so humanitarian aid is like a drop in the ocean, or there's a little rock and the river keeps on flowing. Right. And so it is alleviating some human suffering, but not nearly enough. And if you're not addressing, these dynamics with the UAE particularly, but also other geopolitical actors, and Sudan is one example, but that goes across, Israel in Gaza and Palestine writ large, you need to really hold those actors to account. And this kind of speaks to this broader like degradation of accountability and international humanitarian law, just respect for international law, is further eroded when the US is, wake up in January and all of a sudden the head of state has been extracted from Venezuela and what is going on in Iran now. And so if this kind of global breakdown of law and order is happening, it's like humanitarian aid is a band-aid for a much bigger crisis at a global level. And the future looks quite daunting, and how do we kind of come together in ways that really kind of address these acute, deeply concerning dynamics? And I think with what's unfolding in the Middle East now, the potential for food prices, fuel prices are already going up, and for that to lead to more fracturing, it's like the humanitarian system is never going to be able to navigate and deal sufficiently with those issues. And so how do we kind of address these issues that we talk about in our report around, taxing appropriately, addressing inequalities, and having accountable governance. And as you say, civic space, like activism from different populations is really critical to holding the state to account. And that's what we really want to emphasize. Don't just throw humanitarian assistance at the issue, but ensure the population is holding the state to account.
Where do people find your report?
Our report is available on our website. So if you go to ODI.org/HBG, you will see the report. And the title of the report is called Governing Inequality, Kenya's State, Aid Politics and Perpetual Humanitarian Crisis by ODI Global and the Humanitarian Policy Group.
And I mean, it's why reports like this are necessary for us to understand the gravity of the situation, but then also that points us, that points us towards what we know the solution will be. And that's why there will be then the insistence on good leadership, on making sure that proper systems are set up and ensuring that you don't have to be in this perpetual state of beg, as I refer to it. But I want to thank you both, gentlemen, for joining us this morning to then be able to shine light on some of these issues and the insistence. I mean, Timothy, I hear you say the insistence on good systems, proper governance, insistence on making sure that you close the loophole so that corruption does not continue to be the rat in the corner that eats away at your toes. Because then what you're asking for is a crutch to be able to walk, as opposed to getting rid of the rat. Thank you, both of you, for being here this morning. Dustin Barter is a development and humanitarian researcher, of course, the parts of the originators of this report, together with Timothy Kiprono, who is a public finance, governance and climate finance expert. Thank you, both of you, for joining us this morning to have this conversation, and we look forward to more, because there are more insights to be shared. We move it until it moves.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.